The morning fog hung thick over the countryside as Captain James Morrison adjusted his uniform one last time. His black boots clicked against the stone steps of Windsor Castle as he made his way to the briefing room. After 30 years of service to the Crown, he thought he had seen everything. He was wrong. Captain Morrison called Director Helen Walsh from across the corridor. Her voice carried the weight of something important, something that would change everything. "We need to talk." Privately, James followed her into a small office lined with portraits of past monarchs. The smell of old leather and wood polish filled the air. Helen closed the door and turned to face him, her expression serious. "What I'm about to tell you cannot leave this room," she began, pulling out a thick manila folder. 3 days ago, we received information about Camilla's private estate in the Cotswolds. Our sources suggest there may be items there that belong to the late Queen Elizabeth. James felt his heart skip. Everyone knew the Queen had possessed countless treasures, many of which had gone missing over the years. Some said they were hidden during the war. Others believed they were lost forever. "What kind of items?" he asked, leaning forward in his chair. Helen opened the folder and spread out several photographs. James's eyes widened. There were pictures of jewelry boxes, ornate silverware, and what appeared to be personal letters tied with blue ribbon. "These photos were taken by a maintenance worker at the estate last week," Helen explained. "He was doing routine repairs in the basement when he noticed something unusual behind a false wall. When he looked closer, he found a hidden room." James studied the photographs carefully. One showed a dusty wooden chest with the royal coat of arms carved into its surface. Another revealed shelves lined with crystal glasses and golden chalices. "The worker called the local police, who then contacted us," Helen continued. "We verified the authenticity of several items from these photos. Captain, these aren't just any royal treasures. Some of these pieces were thought to be lost forever." The weight of the discovery settled on James's shoulders. He had always dreamed of finding something like this, but now that the moment was here, he felt overwhelmed. "Why me?" he asked quietly. Helen smiled for the first time since he'd entered the room. "Because you knew her personally. You served as her guard for 15 years. If anyone can identify what belongs to the Crown and what doesn't, it's you." James remembered those years fondly. He had stood beside the Queen during countless ceremonies, traveled with her across the world, and witnessed moments of both joy and sorrow. She had trusted him with her safety, and now he was being asked to help recover her lost treasures. "When do we leave?" he asked. "Tomorrow morning," Helen replied. "We'll need to be discreet. Camilla is currently traveling, so the estate will be mostly empty. We'll have a small team with us, including an art expert and a legal representative." That evening, James sat in his small apartment, looking through old photographs from his years of royal service. There was one of him standing behind the Queen during a state dinner, another of him helping her from a car during a rainy day in Scotland. In every picture, she looked dignified and graceful, even in the most difficult circumstances. He thought about the treasures they might find tomorrow. Were they really hers? How had they ended up in Camilla's estate? The question swirled in his mind as he prepared for what could be the most important mission of his career. The next morning came quickly. James met Helen and the rest of the team at a small airfield outside London. The art expert, Dr. Sarah Chun, was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and gentle hands. The legal representative, Mr. Thomas Bradley, looked nervous but determined. "Remember," Helen said as they boarded the helicopter, "we're not there to accuse anyone of wrongdoing. We're simply investigating and documenting. Whatever we find, we handle it professionally and quietly." The helicopter ride to the Cotswolds took less than an hour. James watched the English countryside pass below them, thinking about all the times he had traveled this same route with the Queen. She had loved this part of England, with its rolling hills and ancient villages. Camilla's estate came into view as they approached. It was a beautiful property, with a large stone house surrounded by gardens and old oak trees. Smoke rose from one of the chimneys, suggesting that some staff were still present. As the helicopter landed on the front lawn, James felt his pulse quicken. Somewhere in that house were treasures that had belonged to the woman he had spent years protecting. Soon, he would hold them in his hands again. The estate manager, Mrs. Patricia Whitmore, met them at the front door. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and worried eyes. "I still can't believe this is happening," she said, wringing her hands. "I've worked here for 20 years, and I never knew about any hidden room. When the maintenance man told me what he'd found, I thought he was making it up." Helen showed her the official documents giving them permission to search the property. Mrs. Whitmore nodded and led them inside. The house was elegant but comfortable, with family photos on the walls and fresh flowers in every room. It felt like a real home, not a museum. James found himself wondering how the Queen's treasures had ended up here. The entrance to the basement is through the kitchen, Mrs. Whitmore explained, leading them down a hallway lined with oil paintings. The maintenance man was fixing a leak in the pipes when he noticed the wall sounded hollow. They descended wooden stairs into a basement that smelled of old stone and dampness. Work lights had been set up, casting strange shadows on the walls. In the far corner, a section of the wall had been removed, revealing a dark opening. "That's where we found everything," Mrs. Whitmore said, pointing to the hole. "It's like someone wanted to keep it hidden forever." James stepped toward the opening, his heart pounding. After 30 years of wondering what had happened to the Queen's missing treasures, he was about to find out. The beam of his flashlight disappeared into the darkness, and he took his first step into the hidden room. The hidden room was larger than James had expected. His flashlight beam swept across stone walls that looked like they hadn't been disturbed in decades. The air was stale but surprisingly dry, which had helped preserve everything inside. "My God," whispered Dr. Chun as she stepped in behind him. "Look at all of this." Wooden shelves lined 3 walls, each one filled with carefully wrapped items. James could see the corners of picture frames, the glint of silver, and the soft shine of what appeared to be pearls. Everything had been stored with obvious care. Helen directed the team to set up proper lighting while James moved deeper into the room. On a table in the center sat an ornate wooden box that made his breath catch in his throat. "I know that box," he said quietly, moving closer. "The Queen used to keep her personal correspondence in it." Dr. Chen joined him, pulling on white cotton gloves. "May I?" James nodded, and she carefully lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of letters, each one tied with ribbon and labeled in elegant handwriting. James recognized the Queen's personal stationery immediately. "These are letters to her mother," Dr. Chen said, reading one of the labels. "And here are some to Princess Margaret. They look like they span several decades." Helen appeared beside them with a camera. "We need to document everything exactly as we find it before we move anything." As the photography began, James explored the rest of the room. On one shelf, he found a collection of small silver picture frames containing photos he remembered from the Queen's private apartments. There was one of her as a young woman with her beloved corgis, another of her wedding day that had never been made public. "Captain," called Mr. Bradley from the far corner. "I think you need to see this." James made his way over to find the legal representative standing in front of a large painting covered by a cloth. When Bradley pulled the cloth away, James gasped. It was a portrait of the Queen painted when she was in her 30s. She was wearing a blue dress and a diamond necklace that James remembered well. But this wasn't just any portrait. It was one that had been commissioned for her private collection, never meant for public viewing. "How did this end up here?" James asked aloud. Mrs. Whitmore, who had been watching quietly from the doorway, stepped forward. "If I may," she said hesitantly, "I think I might know something about that." Everyone turned to look at her. The estate manager's face was pale, and her hands were shaking slightly. "About 5 years ago, Camilla had some work done on the house," she began. "She was renovating the guest wing, and they found this room during the construction. It had been sealed up for decades, maybe longer." Helen frowned. "And she didn't report the discovery?" Mrs. Whitmore looked uncomfortable. She said she needed time to figure out where everything came from. She had the room sealed again and told everyone to keep quiet about it. She said she would handle it properly when the time was right. James felt a mixture of relief and confusion. At least it sounded like Camilla hadn't stolen anything. But why hadn't she contacted the royal household? Dr. Chun had moved to another shelf and was carefully unwrapping what appeared to be a set of china. "These are definitely royal pieces," she said. "Look at the coat of arms on each plate." As the team continued their work, James found himself drawn to a small leather journal sitting on one of the lower shelves. When he opened it, he immediately recognized the handwriting inside. "This is the Queen's private diary," he said in amazement. "I used to see her writing in books like this during quiet moments." Helen looked up from where she was photographing a collection of jewelry. "What does it say?" James read the first few entries, his voice growing softer with each word. "She writes about hiding some of her most precious possessions during the difficult years after the war. She was worried about security and wanted to keep certain things safe." He turned several pages and found an entry that made his heart race. "Listen to this. I have decided to store my most personal treasures in Charles's country house. The basement room that his great-grandfather used during the war years will serve perfectly. Only Charles knows about this arrangement, and I trust him to keep these items safe until they can be properly returned to the royal collection." The room fell silent. Everyone stared at James as the implications of what he had just read became clear. "Charles?" Helen asked quietly. "As in King Charles?" James nodded, flipping through more pages. There are several entries about it. She was working with Charles to create a secure storage space for items that were too valuable or too personal to keep in the main royal residences. Dr. Chen looked up from her examination of a beautiful silver tea service. That would make sense. During the 1970s and 80s, there were concerns about security at several royal properties. I remember reading about increased protection measures. Mrs. Whitmore cleared her throat nervously. "The house did belong to Charles before Camilla inherited it," she said. "It was part of his private estate for many years." James continued reading, finding entry after entry about the Queen's decision to hide her treasures. She wrote about carefully selecting items that held special meaning for her, things she couldn't bear to lose if something happened to the main royal residences. "Here's something interesting," he said. "She mentions that Charles was supposed to retrieve everything after her death, but only if it was safe to do so. She writes that she didn't want to burden the new reign with unnecessary complications." Helen was taking notes furiously. "So this was all planned? The Queen and Charles arranged for these items to be stored here?" James nodded, but then his expression grew troubled. "But why didn't Charles retrieve them after she passed? And why didn't Camilla know about the arrangement?" Mr. Bradley had been examining some legal documents they had found in another box. "I might have an answer to that," he said. "These papers suggest that the storage arrangement was supposed to remain secret until certain conditions were met. It looks like there was a specific protocol for retrieving the items." As the day wore on, the team cataloged hundreds of items. There were photographs, jewelry, personal letters, artwork, and objects that told the story of the Queen's private life. Each discovery brought new questions and new emotions for James. Late in the afternoon, Dr. Chen made a discovery that shocked everyone. Hidden behind several books was a small wooden box containing what appeared to be the Queen's private collection of family jewelry, pieces that had never been photographed or cataloged by the royal collection. "These aren't part of the crown jewels," she explained, holding up a delicate necklace set with sapphires. "These are personal pieces, probably inherited from her mother and grandmother." James recognized several of the pieces from his years of service. He had seen the Queen wear them during private family gatherings, occasions when the public and press were not present. As evening approached, the team had documented everything in the room, but they still hadn't answered the most important questions. How had Camilla really come to possess the Queen's treasures? And what should happen to them now? The answers would have to wait until the next day, when they planned to examine some documents that might reveal more about the secret arrangement between the Queen and her son. James locked the hidden room carefully that night, knowing that tomorrow would bring even more surprises. The second day began with an unexpected phone call. James was having breakfast in the estate's kitchen when Helen's phone rang. Her expression changed from professional calm to genuine surprise as she listened to whoever was on the other end. "That was Buckingham Palace," she said after hanging up. "King Charles wants to speak with us. He's flying here this morning." Mrs. Whitmore nearly dropped her teacup. "The king is coming here? Today?" James felt his stomach tighten. In all his years of service, he had learned to read the signs when something significant was about to happen. The fact that Charles was coming personally, rather than sending representatives, meant this discovery was more important than any of them had realized. 2 hours later, the familiar sound of helicopter blades filled the air above the estate. James watched from the window as the royal helicopter landed on the same spot where their own aircraft had touched down the day before. King Charles III stepped out, followed by his private secretary and 2 security officers. Even at a distance, James could see the tension in the monarch's face. This was not a routine royal visit. Helen and James met the king at the front door. Charles looked older than James remembered, the weight of the crown clearly visible in the lines around his eyes. "Captain Morrison," Charles said, extending his hand. "I remember you well from my mother's service. I understand you've made quite a discovery." James shook the king's hand firmly. "Your Majesty, we've found items that definitely belong to the late Queen. The collection is extensive and appears to have been stored here for many years." Charles nodded gravely. "I was hoping this day would never come," he said quietly. "But perhaps it's time the truth was told." They walked through the house toward the basement, Charles's footsteps echoing in the hallways where he had once played as a child. Mrs. Whitmore had prepared the hidden room with proper lighting, and everything remained exactly as the team had found it. When Charles saw the collection for the first time, his composure nearly broke. He walked slowly among the shelves, touching items gently with his fingertips. "I haven't seen these things in decades," he said, picking up one of the silver picture frames. "This photo was taken at Balmoral when I was 12 years old. Mother kept it on her desk in her private study." Dr. Chen approached carefully. "Your Majesty, we found what appears to be your mother's private diary. The entries explain how these items came to be stored here." Charles turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and relief. "She told you then? Even in death, she's still protecting family secrets." James stepped forward with the diary. "Sir, would you like to read the entries yourself?" Charles took the journal with trembling hands. As he read his mother's words, his expression changed from surprise to understanding to something that looked like regret. "She was always thinking ahead, always protecting us," he said finally. "When she decided to hide these treasures, I was going through my divorce from Diana. The media attention was intense, and there were concerns about security at all the royal properties." Helen had been listening carefully. "So you did know about this arrangement?" Charles set the diary down gently. "I knew she was storing some personal items here, yes. But I had no idea there was so much, or that it included pieces of such historical importance. After Diana's death, after everything that happened, I simply forgot. The loss of my mother was so overwhelming that many of these arrangements slipped my mind." The king walked to the corner where the portrait of his mother hung. He stood looking at it for a long time without speaking. "When Camilla inherited this property, I should have told her about the hidden room," he continued. "But, by then, I had convinced myself that perhaps it was better to leave sleeping dogs lie. I thought if the items were safe and hidden, they could remain that way indefinitely." Mrs. Whitmore spoke up quietly. "Sir, when we found the room 5 years ago, Camilla was very concerned about doing the right thing. She asked me to research the history of the house to try to understand how the items had gotten there." Charles turned to her with interest. "What did she discover?" "She learned that your great-grandfather had used this room during World War II to store valuable items from several royal residences," Mrs. Whitmore explained. "She assumed these treasures were part of that collection and that they had simply been forgotten over the years." "So she didn't know I had placed them there with Mother's permission?" Charles asked. "No, sir. She thought they were much older, possibly stored there during the war, and then overlooked when the house changed hands through the family." James could see the relief on Charles's face. The king had been worried that his wife might be accused of keeping royal treasures without permission. Dr. Chun had been examining some of the jewelry while they talked. "Your Majesty," she said, "some of these pieces are quite extraordinary. This necklace, for instance, appears to be from the early 1800s, and this ring looks like it might have belonged to Queen Victoria." Charles nodded. Mother inherited many pieces from previous generations. She kept the most historically important items in the official royal collection, but she held on to the personal pieces, the ones with family memories attached. As the afternoon progressed, Charles shared stories about many of the items they had found. There was a music box that had belonged to his grandmother, a set of books that his mother had read to him as a child, and dozens of photographs that captured private family moments spanning decades. "This painting," he said, standing in front of the portrait again, "was commissioned for Mother's 35th birthday. The artist captured something in her expression that the official portraits never quite managed. She looks like the woman I remember from my childhood, not just the queen." Helen had been taking careful notes throughout the day. "Your Majesty, what would you like us to do with these items?" Charles was quiet for several minutes before answering. "They should be returned to the royal collection where they belong," he said finally. "But I want to make sure that Camilla's reputation is protected. She did nothing wrong, and I want that to be very clear." James felt a wave of admiration for the king. Even in this complicated situation, his first concern was protecting his wife from unfair criticism. "There's one more thing," Charles added. "Some of these items are so personal, so tied to my mother's private life, that I'm not sure they belong in any official collection. Perhaps they should remain with the family, but stored properly and securely." Dr. Chen looked up from a box of letters she had been examining. "If I may suggest, Your Majesty, we could separate the items into different categories. Historical pieces that belong to the crown, personal items that should remain with the royal family, and perhaps some pieces that could eventually be displayed to honor the late queen's memory." Charles smiled for the first time since arriving. That sounds like something Mother would have approved of. She always believed that these treasures were meant to tell the story of the monarchy, not just sit in storage. As evening approached, the team had created a preliminary plan for cataloging and relocating all the items. But James sensed that the most important discoveries were yet to come. In one corner of the room sat a large trunk that they hadn't yet opened, and Charles kept glancing at it with an expression that suggested he knew what was inside. The large trunk in the corner had been calling to James all day. Every time he looked at it, he noticed King Charles's eyes following his gaze. There was something different about this particular container, something that set it apart from all the other treasures they had discovered. That trunk contains the most precious items of all, Charles said quietly as the team gathered around it. Mother called it her memory box. I helped her pack it myself, just a few months before she passed away. Dr. Chin approached the trunk carefully. It was made of dark wood with brass fittings, and, unlike everything else in the room, it showed no signs of age or dust. Someone had been taking care of it. She asked me to promise that if anything ever happened to her, I would make sure these particular items found their way to the right people, Charles continued. But in the chaos after her death, with all the funeral preparations and the transition of the crown, I simply forgot where we had put it. James felt his heart race as Dr. Chin slowly lifted the heavy lid. Inside, wrapped in silk cloth, were items that immediately brought tears to his eyes. The first thing he saw was a small leather-bound book. When Charles picked it up, James could see that it was filled with handwritten notes in the Queen's careful script. This is her gratitude journal, Charles explained, his voice thick with emotion. Every night for the last 20 years of her life, she wrote down the names of people who had served the crown with particular dedication. She wrote about specific acts of kindness, moments of loyalty, times when someone went above and beyond their duty. Helen moved closer as Charles opened the book. She wrote about people? Not famous people, Charles said, turning the pages slowly. She wrote about the palace staff who stayed late to help with events, guards who showed special kindness to visitors, cooks who remembered her preferences, gardeners who went out of their way to create beautiful displays. She wanted to make sure that good service was never forgotten. James watched in amazement as Charles flipped through dozens of pages filled with names and stories. He could see his own name mentioned several times, along with descriptions of moments he had thought no one had noticed. Here, Charles said, stopping at a page dated just 2 years earlier. Listen to this. Captain Morrison stayed with me during the difficult evening when we received news of Prince Philip's health decline. He didn't have to remain on duty, but he sensed that I needed someone steady nearby. His quiet presence meant more than he will ever know. James felt tears welling up in his eyes. He remembered that evening clearly, but he had never realized the Queen had noticed his decision to stay. Dr. Chun had been carefully unwrapping other items from the trunk. Your Majesty, she said softly, I think you should see this. She held up a small wooden box that contained dozens of thank you cards, all written in the Queen's handwriting, but never sent. James could see that they were addressed to various staff members, including several with his own name on them. She wrote thank you notes that she never gave out. Helen asked in confusion. Charles smiled sadly. Mother was very formal in public, as her position required. But, privately, she felt deeply grateful to everyone who served her. She wrote these cards during her final months, planning to have them delivered after her death. She wanted people to know how much their service had meant to her. James accepted one of the cards with his name on it, with shaking hands. Inside, the Queen had written, Dear Captain Morrison, your 30 years of faithful service have been a source of comfort and strength to me. You have protected not just my physical safety, but my peace of mind. I hope you know that your dedication has never gone unnoticed or unappreciated. With deep gratitude, Elizabeth R. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the emotional weight of these discoveries. This wasn't just about recovering lost treasures anymore. They had stumbled upon the Queen's most private expressions of gratitude and love for the people who had served her. Charles continued unpacking the trunk, revealing photograph albums filled with pictures of staff members and their families. There were photos of palace workers' weddings, children's birthdays, retirement parties, and other personal milestones that the Queen had attended or sent gifts for. She kept track of everyone, James said in amazement, looking through one of the albums. Look, here's a picture from when the head gardener's daughter graduated from university. And here's one from the kitchen staff Christmas party. Dr. Chin found another item that made everyone pause, a small wooden box containing locks of hair tied with ribbons. Each one was labeled with dates and names. These are from her corgis, Charles explained gently. Every time one of her dogs passed away, she kept a small reminder. She loved those animals like they were her children. At the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in the finest silk, was a collection of personal letters that the Queen had written but never sent. Charles handled them with extraordinary care. "These are letters to people she lost," he said quietly. "To my father after he died, to Princess Margaret, to friends who passed away before she did." She wrote to them as a way of working through her grief. Helen wiped away a tear as she watched Charles handle his mother's most private possessions. "Your Majesty, these items are incredibly personal. Are you sure they should be part of any official recovery?" Charles considered the question carefully. "Some of these things should remain private forever," he said. "But the gratitude journal and the thank you cards, these should be shared. The people she wrote about deserve to know how much they meant to her." As they reached the bottom of the trunk, James noticed something unusual. There was a sealed envelope marked with his name in the Queen's handwriting. Charles picked it up and examined it carefully. "She wrote this for you specifically," Charles said, handing the envelope to James. "It's dated just weeks before she died." James opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a letter in the Queen's careful script. "Dear Captain Morrison, if you are reading this letter, it means that the treasures I have hidden have been discovered, probably by you. I chose to write to you specifically because I know that if anyone were to find these items, it would be someone with your integrity and dedication. I trust you to handle whatever you discover with the same discretion and care that you showed throughout your years of service to me. Some of what you find should be shared with the world, as a reminder of the good people who serve the crown. But some should remain private, as all families deserve their private moments and memories. I leave this decision in your capable hands, knowing that you will choose wisely. Thank you for everything you have done, not just for the crown, but for me personally. You have been a true friend, even though protocol prevented me from saying so during my lifetime. With deepest respect and gratitude, Elizabeth R." The weight of the Queen's final request settled on James's shoulders. She had not only trusted him to find her treasures, she had trusted him to decide what should happen to them. As he looked around the room at all the items they had discovered, he realized that tomorrow would bring the most difficult decisions of his entire career. The morning of the third day brought unexpected visitors to the estate. James looked out the window to see several cars arriving, carrying people he recognized from his years of royal service. Word had somehow gotten out about the discovery, and former palace staff members were coming to see what had been found. King Charles had spent the night at the estate, and James found him in the kitchen early that morning, looking tired but determined. "I've been thinking about Mother's letter to you," Charles said over coffee. "She gave you a tremendous responsibility, but she also gave you the authority to make the right decisions. I want you to know that whatever you decide, you have my full support." James had barely slept, thinking about the Queen's words and the weight of her trust. "Your Majesty, I think I know what she would have wanted." They returned to the hidden room, where Dr. Chun and Helen were already working. The first order of business was to contact the people mentioned in the Queen's gratitude journal. James had made a list the night before, and he was amazed to discover how many of them were still alive and could be reached. The first phone call was to Mrs. Dorothy Stevens, who had worked in the palace kitchen for 40 years. When Helen explained why she was calling and read the Queen's entry about her, Mrs. Stevens broke down in tears. She remembered the time I stayed up all night making special soup when she was ill. Mrs. Stevens asked through her sobs. That was 20 years ago. I never thought she even noticed. Similar calls were made throughout the morning. A retired gardener learned that the Queen had written about his beautiful rose garden. A former security guard discovered that she had noticed how gently he treated nervous visitors. A cleaning lady found out that the Queen had appreciated her care in handling delicate antiques. Each conversation brought tears and amazement. People who had spent decades wondering if their service had mattered were learning that every kindness had been seen and remembered. By afternoon, many of these former staff members had arrived at the estate. Mrs. Whitmore had prepared tea and sandwiches, turning the normally quiet house into a bustling gathering of people sharing memories. James watched as King Charles moved among the group, thanking each person personally for their years of service. Many of them had never spoken directly to him before, and the informal atmosphere allowed for conversations that would never have been possible in the formal palace setting. Captain Morrison called out Mr. Harold Jenkins, a former palace electrician. "Do you remember the night the power went out during the state dinner for the French president?" James smiled at the memory. "How could I forget? You worked all night to get the lights back on." "The Queen wrote about that night," Dr. Chun said, consulting the gratitude journal. "She wrote that Mr. Jenkins saved the evening and possibly an important diplomatic relationship. She wanted to recommend him for an honor, but she was told it wasn't appropriate since it was just doing his job." Mr. Jenkins's eyes filled with tears. She wanted to give me an honor? For fixing some lights. King Charles stepped forward. It's never too late to correct an oversight, he said. I think Mother would approve if we found a way to properly recognize service that she felt was exceptional. As the day progressed, James and his team worked on separating the treasures according to the Queen's wishes and his own judgment. The historical pieces would return to the royal collection. The deeply personal items would remain private. But the gratitude journal and the thank you cards would be shared with the people who deserved to know how much they had meant to their queen. Dr. Chun had been working on a special project throughout the day. I've been photographing pages from the gratitude journal, she explained to James. With His Majesty's permission, I'd like to create a special book that could be given to the families of the people mentioned. Many of the staff members mentioned have children and grandchildren who would treasure knowing about their loved ones' recognition. James thought this was exactly what the Queen would have wanted. She had always believed that good service should be remembered and celebrated. In the late afternoon, as the former staff members were preparing to leave, King Charles made an announcement that surprised everyone. My mother left instructions that if these treasures were ever discovered, there should be a proper acknowledgement of the people who served her faithfully, he said. I am announcing today the creation of the Queen Elizabeth Service Recognition Awards, which will honor palace staff members, past and present, who have shown exceptional dedication. The applause was immediate and heartfelt. Several people were crying, overwhelmed by this unexpected honor. James found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them all to this moment. What had started as a routine investigation into possibly stolen treasures had become something much more meaningful. They had discovered not just the Queen's hidden possessions, but her hidden heart. As evening approached, the team prepared for their final task, carefully packing and transporting the items that would return to the royal collection. Each piece was wrapped with the same care the Queen had shown when hiding them decades earlier. Mrs. Whitmore approached James as he supervised the packing. Captain Morrison, she said quietly, I want to thank you for handling all of this so beautifully. When we first discovered that room, I was terrified that it would cause trouble for the family. Instead, it's brought out something wonderful. James smiled at her. I think that's what the Queen intended all along. She was always thinking about other people, always finding ways to show that she cared. King Charles pulled James aside as they prepared to leave the estate. Captain Morrison, my mother's final letter to you mentioned that you were more than just a guard to her. You were a friend. I want you to know that the feeling was mutual. Some of her happiest memories from her later years involved the comfortable presence of people like you, who made her feel safe and cared for. James felt the weight of 30 years of service settling into something that felt like completion. He had spent his career protecting the Queen's physical safety, but, in the end, he had also helped protect her legacy of kindness and gratitude. As the helicopters prepared to take off from the estate, carrying the recovered treasures back to their proper home, James took one last look at the house where they had made their extraordinary discovery. The hidden room was empty now, but it had served its purpose. It had kept the Queen's most precious possessions safe until the right moment for their discovery. 3 months later, James attended the first Queen Elizabeth Service Recognition Awards ceremony at Buckingham Palace. Watching former colleagues receive honors they richly deserved, he thought about the letter that had changed everything. The Queen had trusted him to make the right decisions, and seeing the joy on the faces of the people being honored, he knew he had chosen correctly. In his pocket, he carried a small photograph that had been found in the trunk, a candid picture of the Queen laughing with a group of palace staff during an informal moment. It reminded him that behind the crown and the protocol was a woman who had never forgotten the people who served her faithfully. The recovery of the Queen's treasures had ended, but the real treasure, the knowledge that service and kindness are never forgotten, would last forever. James had spent his career protecting a queen, but, in the end, she had protected something even more valuable, the recognition that every act of service, no matter how small, has meaning and worth. As he looked around the room at all the people whose lives had been touched by the Queen's hidden expressions of gratitude, James realized that some treasures are more valuable than gold or jewels. Some treasures are found in the human heart, and those are the ones that truly last forever.